Welcome to Southbank Centre's In the Green Room. I'm Ted Hodgkinson, Head of Literature and Spoken Word at Southbank Centre, and this evening I'm delighted to be joined by Max Porter. The author of 3 deceptively slim books to date, Max Porter is a writer who draws on an expansive array of influences from hip-hop to folklore to create works of art which enliven and renew our sense of the possibilities of fiction and even of literature. One of our most innovative writers, his collage-like use of forms from prose poem to undulating lines of overheard village gossip are always alive to the visceral detail of daily life. From the mordant slapstick of grief is the thing with feathers about a bereaved father and sons visited by a foul-mouthed crow, to the evocation of an English village haunted by the pungent presence of a green man-like figure in Lanny, to his most recent book, a series of written pictures, 7 oils and a sketch, which capture Francis Bacon's final flailing, defiant moments on his deathbed in a hospital in Madrid. Max has been involved in various readings and events at Southbank Centre over the years, including an abridged performance of Lanny, which he also took part in, and a reading of Sylvia Plath's Letters. And full disclosure, we're former colleagues who used to work in editorial at Granta. He is an editor of Booker Prize-winning novels such as The Luminaries, and me as online editor and purveyor of bad puns in the office kitchenette. Max, it's great to be talking to you today.
Hi, Ted. Thanks for having me.
I just want to ask you firstly, if you could maybe tell us a bit about where you're calling from and how this last little phase of lockdown has been treating you. I think you were homeschooling until quite recently, and I think you're at home in Bath. And I'm just wondering if you could give us a little bit of a picture of where you are.
Yeah, I'm in Bath. Well, I'm in Larkhall on the edge of Bath. We've lived here for about 4 years. We are emerging. Yesterday I had my lockdown hair removed. I see you've bravely kept yours. I think
looks good, by the way.
Sort of blinking into the light, and it helps that it is so beautiful here. I mean, I imagine it's a stunning evening on the South Bank. We were homeschooling. I paused a novel last year. I binned a novel, then I paused one, and then I finally got cracking when the children went back after Christmas and wrote fast and furiously for a few weeks, and that's been incredible. I've written quite differently recently than I have before, and my practice has been very collaborative. I've been doing music projects and theatre projects and a film project. But ultimately, I would say I am calling from family home. It's busy. Got one on the PlayStation, one doing his homework, one cooking. So a busy family home feeling is sort of discombobulated and uneasy as most of us are, but also grateful for the quality time and the intimacy of this domestic moment. Yeah.
It's interesting that you say the floodgates opened with the writing, and also that you've been seeking out more collaboration. Do you think that feels very? I can understand that instinct after months of isolation and so on. Did you feel that was just a natural urge for you after lockdown? You wanted to seek out other artists and make work with them?
No, weirdly, now I don't want to see anyone. I'm desperately scared of other human beings. Kind of battening down the hatches. No, it was a lockdown thing. I found perversely, because I'm someone that has always felt, as you know, very uneasy about being one writer on the stage, certainly one writer on a pedestal of any kind as an authority on their work, on other people's work. I've always tried to dismantle or interrogate that and share the space or diversify the space wherever possible. And my work is polyphonic, so it never made sense for me to be the only one speaking of it or performing it. So lockdown, curiously, was an incredibly productive moment for me, because people getting in touch from other parts of the world and from other disciplines saying, do you want to try something? Send me language. Let me see if I write songs in relation to it, or send me a book. Let me see what direction I take it from, in a theatrical sense or something. So no, last year was an incredibly kind of, I felt like a bit like the man that planted trees last year. We planted a number of seeds. Some of them will come to fruition this year and next, and some of them won't. Some of them were oddly compatible with the digital, with the Zoom lifestyle. Others had to change. A friend of mine who's an actor, his keyword is pivot. we pivoted a number of times. And I think that's good. It's a good lesson for me to be less precious or fixated on the individual product. I'm unhappy about that in the literary, in the publishing world, the fetishization and or fixation on the product to be sold. I'm much more interested in the communal and communicative work around it, and literacy. And this year's been an interesting year to get involved in a number of literacy projects and mentoring projects. So I feel I've had quite a good year in relation to other people, despite having seen almost nobody.
I want to ask you a bit more about those trees you've been planting in a moment, but just while we're thinking about you in your intimate home space, I just want to ask you about where you write, actually, because I have this image of you surrounded by your boys at home and probably writing at the kitchen table, surrounded by noise and chatter. Is that right? Or do you kind of take yourself off and write quietly on your own? And I also can imagine you having a kind of artistic sort of studio, because I know you kind of make sort of objects of various kind of little mini sculptures. So I wonder if you could just...
I make some quite big sculptures.
Sorry, big sculptures.
No, you're right. It's generally small. No, it's entirely kitchen table. I don't even have a laptop, so I can't even go and write in a cafe. I have this computer I speak to you on now, and just the other side of that door is the child on the PS4. And I like that. And it has been very sort of organically, I suppose, and necessarily and practically related to my work. I've been interested in the lives of children and parenting, and would I want to go and do the Franzen-esque 3 months bird watching or that different writers need, perhaps for a different project, but at this time in my life, it's important to be around these voices. And also the language of young people is so naturally revitalizing and interesting and funny and energizing that I'm pleased to be around it. In lockdown with the Francis Bacon book, I wrote this book in what could be described as a sort of intense, fractured flow state. I had very intense sessions where I would immerse myself in the work, in paintings, and then respond to it, building these sort of imaginary interviews. And I find actually I can get there. I don't need to travel, and I certainly don't need peace and quiet. I can plug my headphones in and get into that space. And I'm aware that writers are always trying to develop themselves and their attention spans and reconcile different states of attention to the world around them. And one just has to be grateful when it happens. It happened with that. It might not happen with the next one. So each book, I hope I will always deal with in a very bespoke way. I mean, the book I've just written now needed, for the first time probably in my entire adult life, needed me to stop reading. I haven't read more than 3 books in 3 months, which is a record, and it feels very odd. And I miss reading, like almost as if my lover has left me. I'm terribly alone not reading, because I read ravenously. So I'm not even reading poetry at the moment, and poetry has been my lifeblood.
Wow, because you're so immersed in what you're doing at the moment. That's really interesting.
It was just this project. I couldn't handle any other voices in my head. I think also the political crises we're in now, I was sort of the news and the books and the world and the sort of scale of the pain of others and the scale of injustice in the world. It was all so noisy in my head that I actually had to, I found that I think I would have had some kind of collapse if I had carried on pouring stuff in. I had to stop. I spend quite a lot of time gazing at hedges and trees at the moment, just trying to find some stillness. And that's been what this book's required. I hope it won't always be the case.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually been enjoying your tweets of trees that have fences and other objects sort of within the bodies. It feels quite meditative, those images. I want to ask about, I mean, that's very interesting because it does feel quite familiar. And I know there are a lot of writers who found it very hard to write at all, and perhaps also to read during this time. I know there are a lot of writers who find it very hard to read other people's work when they're writing at all. So perhaps as an editor, you're a bit unusual in that you can continue to read in the depths of another project. I just want to ask you about that point you made a moment ago about language and being around the language of younger people, because one of the things that really strikes me about your writing is its oral quality, its verbal quality, and it's so apparent when you read it, and it's such a physical performance, and you get that real sense that it's meant to be read and that it was almost intended to be a performance. I just wonder if how you envisage your work when you're writing it. Do you read it aloud? Do you think of it as something that eventually will be performed, that will hit the ear, rather than be a piece of writing on a page?
I don't particularly, I don't think, and I don't read it aloud as I write it, but I believe, I suppose what hearing you describe that, I suppose what I'm after is a kind of, I'm hoping for some kind of linguistic performance to occur in the brain of the reader ultimately, and I want that to be quite an ambitious collaboration between text and reader. So, for example, the polyphonic device in Lanny, and I suppose I'm a painterly writer in that regard. I consider the book, the written thing, to be an opportunity to employ various techniques and tactics and juxtapositional energies and sequences and devices, like a painter might say, that's not working, that's working. Mm-hmm. And listening to it quite carefully, and I guess understanding that the reader is as much a part of the oral tradition as you are, and therefore ultimately the text read, particularly in a physical book by a physical body, is related to the heartbeat, to the embodied reader, and speaks of and about those things as well. I guess musicality and rhythm, and a love, as you know, a love of the spoken word informs all my work. But I don't, the performative side of it, I think I just happen to enjoy reading my work, or reading the last two books at least aloud. I don't think I always will. They've asked for it in a way, and I like other people reading my work back to me. I really like. I mean, with Lanny, as you know, as we took it on from the performance we did with you, we became even less worried about the idea of an official version or a final text. We would sometimes improvise it. And I really liked that, because it seemed to connect the book, this investigation of myth, or ideas of Englishness, or ideas of childhood innocence, back out to the sort of storytelling waterbed, if you like. And it changed in different locations, and it changed in different weather systems and different moods and energies. And despite never mentioning the B word, that book actually became a sort of, wherever we performed it, it became sort of self-portrait of a time in this country when people are acutely aware of what stories they are telling and being told, and how that is mediated by the publishing industry, or the newspaper you read, or the podcast you listen to. So it became a sort of fluid question machine, and I think I like that. And if you were asking me to kind of create a working definition of the novel, I like the idea of novels as question machines that don't, if they're built well enough, don't stop asking questions when you stop reading them.
It's a wonderful definition, and I love that image of the waterbed, and the kind of the book, or the language in the book, making its way back into the culture and not holding too tight a rein on it. For those of you who haven't read Lanny, which I have here, in fact, I think one of the really, when we're talking about this sort of fluidity of the text, I think it's just important to note that the text is very literally undulating across the page in some passages. And that text, particularly the voices of the village, has this sort of overheard, eavesdropped quality, where these are phrases that you get the sense of being heard by this character of dead Papa Toothwort, who is a sort of green man-like mercurial figure. Since you mentioned the reading of Lanny and the project that we did together, I want to ask you about what that experience was like. I mean, I think this was the first of this kind of reading you did with Lanny. I know obviously you'd been involved with the Complicité production of Grief is a Thing with Feathers. I know since then, as you say, you've done multiple readings of it, but what was it like taking the book into that space of the Purcell Room and bringing it to life with a band, and sort of inhabiting the character? You played dead Papa Toothwort, and we had a fantastic cast of playing the different characters. What was it like being one of your characters instead of being the writer of it?
That's a nice question. There's so much going on an evening like that. As I say, sort of in a time like this, obviously personal things, like it being sort of my book launch, because it was the thing that friends and family came to. being in the Southbank as a sort of iconic location, but also the sense of, particularly in the Purcell rooms, of the sense of the book as almost as chamber music and as a thing that was going to unfix itself from the published object and become no longer my own, simultaneously very much my own, and myself in the role, particularly as Dead Papa Toothwort, of the sort of mythic conductor of voices, which is a role I'm simultaneously a little bit uneasy playing, but also recognise is very novelistic in nature, and also humbling, exhilarating, and fun. You know, the thing about the folk drone that we had was that it is very beautiful. There is no sound in the world, I don't think, like a double bass, a bowed double bass. And we had the voices that had been recorded. So suddenly there were a great many people in the room that weren't actually in the room. And I'm very interested in ghosts and hauntology, particularly in a place like the Southbank, where you watch a performance on those stages and you are, if you've been to hundreds of performances over the years in those spaces, you're inevitably confronted by the ghosts of previous performances and therefore previous selves, previous listenings. So the room before, even when it was just 5 of us warming up in the daytime, felt very busy with voices and ghosts all confronting the idea of performance and of text and whose voice it is. And the actors were so incredible. I mean, you got people who not only were great actors and really inhabited the roles in interesting ways, but were very playful with it. And it was a very, I guess looking back on it, it was probably the best a writer could possibly hope for in presenting a work that the ambition of which they hadn't quite reconciled themselves to. I don't know how it would work. One never does. So to do it in that space with that quality, that caliber of performers and the sound and everything being so good, it was incredible. Plus, you know, once a bookseller, always a bookseller. The fact that there's also, you go out and have a drink and buy a book is the kind of classic mwah of the Southbank experience as well. I went and spent a load of money that I didn't really have at that time in foils, and so I had my little plastic foils bag and my plastic pint of beer, and I felt like I was a classic punter at my own gig. It's great. It was magical.
It makes it easier to part with, you know, your money, I suppose, after you've had that kind of experience. But yeah, Stephen Mangan and Lydia Wilson were fantastic. The actors who played Lanny's mum and Lanny's dad, and Lanny was there in a sort of spectral way. But yeah, I'm so glad to hear that, and the way you conjure that sense of the voices being the air being thick with voices and presences, because it is a space that's very thick with that kind of those sort of echoes and traces of the past.
When I came to the one that came before this Plath event I did with you, when the Hughes letters were read, and you'll have to remind me the name of the actress that read them. It was Simon Armitage, wasn't it? And an actor, female actor whose name I can't remember. No, it was, what was most startling about that, and I think in a way has been an inspiration for me in the way I deal with legacy and reputation and the sort of interrogation of big literary figures, and whether you leave them alone or whether you ruffle their feathers. No pun intended. And I remember hearing the disembodied voice of Hughes coming out of the speakers at that event, and finding it, partly because I think his letters are his greatest book in a way, but finding it that it was inseparable from the sort of function of the institution itself. Do you know what I mean? That it was a progressive art institution's primary job in a way to have 20 whatever I was year old me terrified of the voice of Ted Hughes emerging from the concrete walls, and wondering how other people responded to that, and thinking to myself already how interesting that in this room there are maybe 1,000 different, quite calibrated and quite specific, culturally conditioned responses to that man's voice. And he's long gone. He can't do anything about it. We are using his voice to recharge, analyze, interrogate our own responses to legacy, myth, obsession, death, suicide, everything. So yeah, I love it.
I guess that was one of the interesting things about the Plath event you're also part of, was that in a sense you were all inhabiting Plath's voice in different ways, because this was an event where we had a range of different writers who would read letters from Plath, and then Lydia Wilson herself kind of playing Plath, if you like, in between. And you read some poems of Plath's, and Lavinia Greenlaw and others taking part in that kind of channeled Plath's voice. And in a sense, as you say, everyone had a slightly differently calibrated version of Plath's voice, but we all got to experience those different versions. And I suppose it's interesting to me that you, as a writer who have this very porous sense of, I think, of genre and of the relationship between different art forms, so respond so strongly to space like Southbank Centre, where culture is not simply an artifact, but it's a living exchange. It's a conversation that's going on. Yeah.
But also that there is this sense of the Southbank. For me, there was always this sense of the public being performed to in ways they're not sure in ways that are not simply the work of art stuck to the wall. So actually the Bacon book, the idea that in my most recent work you have Bacon in conversation with Bacon, possibly wearing a Bacon mask, possibly wearing a David Sylvester mask, possibly wearing a Melvin Bragg mask or a Picasso mask or a Henrietta Moraes mask, and that they are playing the game, the representational game, which is started by the firing gun of the public's engagement with art. Yes. And that being something that moves from the festival hall, to the Museum of Moving Image when I was 8, it moves between those spaces and rewards further attempt. The more you go back, the more you engage with those institutions and between them, crucially in the spaces between them, with your social life, with your reading, with your studying, with your, with the time you spend in those places when you're not there, the greater it is, the more generative it is as a space.
So glad you brought up the Bacon book, because that's I wanted to ask you actually, and relatedly to what we've been talking about, I think one of the things that's interesting about my experience of reading the book is it's almost as though you're trying to turn language into paint at some points, that trying to create the sort of textural, lumpy and jagged qualities of a Bacon painting. And that's done through the kind of that sense of your sonic and acoustic, closeness to your own language. But also, as you say, it's a kind of mock interview at some points. It's deliberately structured to be almost a sort of Bacon's response to a hostile interview, it seemed to me. And so I guess in another sense, you're very much in dialogue with, I think as you put it earlier, like ruffling the feathers with a major artist, a major figure within art like that. It's really interesting to me that you deliberately kind of avoided doing anything that was remotely biographical or sort of academic in any way, and wanted to inhabit that experience of the paint and the kind of what's on the canvas. And again, that feels like you're pushing your art your writing in another direction, which I guess is another part of Southbank, another dimension to Southbank Centre as well. There's another affinity that you have with the space that you're.
Yeah. Well, also, I'm bodily a part of your space in a weird way. My skin cells are all over it. I'm just unpacking the Bacon book at the moment, and here on my desk is the Hayward Gallery catalogue,
right,
from 20 years ago. As a student, I would go every day and do my reading in the festival hall bar until I met my friend, or my girlfriend after college. So there's a sense that the thinking one is doing between art and language. There is no better place to do it. I think with the Bacon book, you've got to respond to the chat. Bacon's fixation over his life, with not only with the sound of his own voice and the sound of the question of his own selfhood and his achievements, but also like his certain preoccupations, such as thickness and thinness and avoiding illustration at all costs. Those have to be the things that you address head on when you write about him. So. Nothing illustrative, but also something that quotes itself and is repetitive. Something highly camp, but nothing so weak as telling the Soho anecdotes that have been told so many times before. So you have to sort of be on your toes, but also ultimately, it's not about. I wasn't writing about the history of dance music or ballet or concrete architecture. I was writing about paint, and ultimately the shrine in which we have to be worshipping, and if we're talking about Bacon or interrogating it, is paint. And so that thickness and thinness and smearing and accident and splashing, how do you do that in language? And you're destined to fail. And so because there are different art forms. It's a bit like sort of people that try and write like Arvo Part, what would the language need to look like? And ultimately, I think if the book is sort of repellent, it's repellent on Bacon's terms at least. If it's intimate, it's an intimacy that was highly regulated by his own sort of hagiographic imperative upon himself in his own myth making. So I think that the thinking about that, I mean, it's odd actually talking to you and having this catalogue here, because that is, I don't want to say that everyone needs to be thinking about things for a very, very long time in order to make good work or interesting work. But I do think there must be something good, for me at least, about thinking about the work of an artist like Bacon for a very long time, for most of my adult life. I am in conversation when I start to write about Bacon with my slightly depressed 17-year-old nerdy self, excited to be on a day trip to London with his mum where we're going to smoke fags and my stepdad won't know, in conversation with myself as sexual being, as political being, as failed handler of paint, as disillusioned art historian on the other side of the river, as handler of other people's content, uneasy with the art world or with the publishing world. All those selves collide, as they should, in the writing of a book like this. And it doesn't, I therefore think it doesn't have to be, or at least the least interesting thing it could be is directly biographical or Wikipediable, because we all know those facts, they're out there. What we don't know is what happens when you juxtapose these things and unpick them and do a sort of post-mortem on them all, which is I suppose what the book is an attempt to do.
Yeah, and in a sense to grant them a right of reply and a voice, in that, granting them added sort of dimensions as well. It's nice that you mentioned your 17-year-old self in the bar at Southbank Centre, because and how clearly that there's lots of things that have been germinating for you in that space for a long time. I actually want to ask you.
It's the best gig I've ever seen on the Southbank. If you're asking me what my number one is, you're not, but let's imagine you just asked me, what's my number one gig? What's my number one gig? And it's impossible, those questions are impossible. It's like, what's your favourite book? But gun to my head, it's seeing Ali Farka Touré play.
Oh, amazing.
In the Festival Hall, which was as extraordinary as you would imagine it would be. An old man at the peak of his powers a couple of years from the end. Just staggering. Anyway, sorry, carry on. I interrupted.
No, I'm glad.
My constant advert for the Southbank Centre.
Thank you for putting the gun.
They do a lovely pork pie. They used to do a lovely pork pie in the restaurant at the front.
Well, but I do actually want to ask you about something that you told me once in the bar at Southbank Centre, which is that I think it was after a reading that we'd both been to, and we were having a beer, and you told me that you and your wife had made an agreement that if there was ever a nuclear attack and the sirens were up there, that you had agreed with your wife to meet at the Southbank Centre. And that's always stayed with me, the idea of you and your wife from different, at the time you were living in London, making your way to the Southbank. Now, I'm not sure it's sort of nuclear attack proof, but I've always felt that was that you held it in such close affection that would be the place that you and your wife would meet in that circumstance.
Well, we came, it's ideally located. Congrats on the location, brilliant. Partly, I think, a sort of shared love of modernism and brutalism. Also, the meeting of childhood memories. So, our Christmas treat as children was that we'd come up to see, they used to do those family shows at Christmas. I guess the last one we ever saw as a family, I was older, but it was the Northern Lights dramatization. Whatever those shows were, year and year, we used to do them. And coming up to Momi and the Hayward Gallery and stuff. And I had a cool uncle that lived in London, and I would come up and he'd take me to the Southbank. And I think that we both felt that leaving London is a difficult thing to do when you love it. And we lived in South London for 20 years, and it broke my heart to leave, whether the decision was right or wrong, separately from that. But I often think, what have I missed this year about London? And culture is obviously high on the list, and friends and work contacts, and Brockwell Park. There's a part of me that lives in Brockwell Park till the day I die. But Waterloo Bridge, coming from north to south, i.e. heading home at around about this time of the evening, or going to a thing at the Southbank, knowing that you're going to meet in the bar and one of you's got the tickets, is just affordable. Let's keep the advert running, right? Affordable tickets for people, because that was one of the main imperatives of of what the Southbank has been so committed to over the years, was the democratization of the art experience in the heart of London. And I buy into that fully, wholly. I couldn't find any cynicism in my whole being about that effort and how that's been. Although I'm sure people can manage it, right? We live in cynical times. But yeah, we always felt that if we had no mobile phones and couldn't say to each other, it's this or that, then that would of course be the place. So it's weird what medicine culture must be to actually rush, with my beloved coming from a different direction, as you say, to probably the least safe place in London, in as much as that's probably where the bomb is going to drop. But that's what feels like home. You know, that's why we signed a petition to save the skate park. Because if I came back from a voyage to Mars and walked down the Southbank and got as far as how say I'm coming from the Westminster direction, if I got as far as the bridge and Hungerford Bridge and couldn't hear the clack clack of ollies, then someone has stolen London. You know, and that it's as embedded as that for the citizens of a city, I think. The sound, the fabric, the food, everything.
That's wonderful to hear, that it's a place of home for you and your beloved. And I think that sense of it's democratizing the art is so fundamental to what the space means and what it is. You mentioned some trees you've been planting and some of the projects you've been working on. And I'm just curious to hear a little bit more, if you're able to say, because I know that you were at one point, there was a novel you were writing, I think, about a saint, and perhaps another book about intimacy, or that might have been the same book. But I'm just curious whether you've gone back to things that you were working on before the pandemic, or whether they're just, you've started things that completely afresh. What are you working on at the moment?
I think I have preoccupations that develop, and I really hope that they would never be contained in a particular art form or a particular practice. So the ideas that I was writing about, as you say, with intimacy, I think probably I should be honest in terms of what survives and what doesn't. That's probably Bacon. That's probably the Beckettian setup of two people playing at interviewer and interviewee and or therapist and patient, and or myth and story. You know, so that relationship, the questioning as love relationship, I think became Bacon. And I think as I consider I'm working on the Bacon book to adapt it, and I think that is that's the direction it will go in, is more the kind of love, so actually between, say, for example, between Sylvester and Bacon over many years. What is it like to keep on having very good and in-depth conversations with someone about art and what they're trying to do and how they've changed and it's changed and their failures and their ambitions. And I'm very interested in that. I'm very interested in the dramatic potential of that as well as the spiritual. The latest book I've been writing is a kind of expansion of the polyphonic work that was in Lanny. It's about who gets to tell, or when we both worked in publishing, there's always this kind of in vogue sense of an interlinked collection of short stories, and whether that is a novel. And I've always been interested in what is a novel. Why are we relatively conservative, possibly perhaps now more than in the last 50 or 100 years, about what a novel means? It's apparently, one would think from looking at the algorithmic marketplace that it is a socially realist undertaking with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that seems to me very shallow plate. So I'm interested in what would happen if it was a collection of short stories that wasn't linked, or was linked in a way that let the viewer do the linking, the reader do against a Freudian slip. What is looking, what is reading, how are those activities similar? How is one loaded up with signs? How is one empty? All these sorts of questions. And I've written it according to a visual scheme, which is quite different to how I normally write. I wrote a short film for a friend who's an actor, and that's going to be made, and that's going to be widened out into a musical and theatrical thing. I'm busy, and I think I'm probably, actually, being honest, the most, once an editor, always an editor. The thing that has most revitalized and kept me interested and preoccupied my kind of 3 a.m. thinking about writing and why we write and what our responsibilities are, and the relationship between activism and writing and various systemic inequalities in the world and what one should do and when one should shut up and when one should speak and all these sorts of questions. The best thing for that is not my own work, it's the work of others and the work I'm doing. I've got this really lovely, I'd almost say like a deck of cards, a hand of people who I'm working with. Some are official mentorship schemes, some are volunteer work, some are informal, some are quite formal, some have a publishing destination in mind, some are much more holistic. And God, I love to talk with other people about their work and to be in other people's work, making it most itself, nothing to do with me, you know. It's a wonderful, it's the best job in the world. So I suppose that's the biggest bag of seeds I'm planting at the moment is other people's trees, and that always interests and excites me.
Speaks to your generosity, I think, Max. And also I think it's quite rare. I think often editors who kind of migrate into being writers don't always look back into the editorial direction, but actually that sense of nurturing other voices and that being such an important part of what you do. I mean, I think that's evident in the work itself as well, that it has that sense of the ongoing pushing at the boundaries and sort of incorporating other inferences and voices in the work as well.
So, I mean, it is just other people should be much more interesting than oneself. I think that from a sort of spiritual point of view, the sort of suspension of the ego to discover what is possible in you know, cosmic harmony, well, be it cosmic harmonies or the interesting bloke next door you never spoke to. And I think we are in this country very obviously politically divided, but also, you know, writing Lanny, and I think we discussed this before, I found out that we're the most age segregated country in Europe, and I worry about these things. You know that I'm a professional worrier in many ways, but I do worry about that sort of breakdown of communication or reliance on certain strategies of communication which are inherently violent. So I suppose I'm becoming more, despite having written what the Times called my hippie nonsense, I'm actually becoming more of a nonsense hippie as I seek to understand what this is all about and what our responsibilities are moving forward.
We could go on all night. Thank you so much, Max. It's been such a joy talking to you and just hearing your effervescent love of Southbank Centre, and we can't wait to welcome you back and to do more things.
The first place I'll come, man. I'll be up. In fact, funnily enough, I just got an invitation this afternoon to do an event. I better not say who it's for because you reveal your programme tactically, but there is an event happening at Southbank I've just agreed to do later in the year. So you are the first people I'm coming to see.
Say no more. We can't wait to have you there. Yeah. And thanks so much to the audience and to Claire for doing the captioning and everybody for being here. And see you soon, Max.
Take care, everybody. Thanks, Ted.